The canyon closed on a morning in late autumn. No warning, no telegraph, just the sudden presence of federal marshals at both ends of the valley, and a line of wagons turned back toward settlements they'd left weeks before. By noon, smoke rose from homesteads being evacuated. By nightfall, the road through Devil's Gate was empty for the first time in 7 years. But somewhere in that silence, before the last rider cleared the rim, a woman and her infant disappeared from the official records. They should have died in what came after. Instead, they lived. And no one could say for certain who pulled them out, or why he rode back into a place every lawman in the territory was about to seal shut. Some said he was a ghost, others said he was a fool. A few, who'd seen him once in the failing light, said he was neither. Just a man who understood that certain debts couldn't be squared with a badge or a bullet, that sometimes the only law that mattered was the one carved into bone and memory, older than any courthouse, older than any constitution. And that in the space between justice and survival, there existed a kind of reckoning that never made it into newspapers or trial transcripts. What remained was a question no one could answer cleanly. What makes a man ride toward danger when every sensible soul is riding away? And what did he know about that canyon that made him willing to risk everything for two people he'd never met? The autumn of 1882 came to Utah territory with a dryness that turned the air to glass. In the settlements scattered along the eastern slopes, people spoke in low voices about water rights and winter stores, about the railroad spur that had stopped construction 30 miles short of where it was promised, about the growing tension between those who'd claimed land early and those who'd arrived after, hungry and desperate. The town of Milford sat at the junction of two valleys, a collection of timber storefronts and canvas-topped homes that seemed always on the verge of either blooming into something permanent or blowing away entirely. It was not a place where people asked too many questions. Most who settled there had reasons for choosing distance over comfort. They built their lives in the margins, in the unincorporated stretches where territorial law moved slowly and unevenly, where a man's past mattered less than his willingness to work and keep to himself. The main street held a mercantile, a land office, a stable, and a saloon that doubled as a meeting hall when the circuit preacher came through. At the north end stood a modest church with a bell that hadn't rung in months, not since the minister moved on to a larger congregation in Provo. At the south end, a blacksmith's forge sent up sparks at all hours, tended by a broad-shouldered man named Calhoun who never spoke of where he'd learned his trade. In the center of it all was the land office, run by a clerk named Pharaoh who kept the claims records and processed the fees for homesteaders filing under the federal acts. He was a thin man with ink-stained fingers and a manner that suggested he'd once aspired to something more than counting acres in a high desert valley. He wore a collar even in the heat and kept his office neat, the maps pinned flat on the walls, the ledgers stacked in chronological order. People respected him because he was fair, and because fairness was a rare enough quality that it commanded a kind of quiet authority. But in the weeks leading up to the closure, Pharaoh had grown nervous. He took longer with each transaction, asked more questions, cross-referenced claims against maps that seemed to shift slightly every time he unrolled them. He began staying late, lamplight visible through his window, long after the rest of the town had shuttered itself against the cold. When asked, he said only that there were discrepancies in the northern filings, overlaps that needed resolving before winter set in. No one pressed him. Discrepancies were common enough in a region where surveys were approximate, and boundaries often depended on landmarks that might or might not exist. What people didn't know was that Pharaoh had begun receiving telegrams from the territorial office in Salt Lake City. Terse messages that asked about specific parcels, specific names, instructions to delay certain filings, to hold certain claims without explanation. And then, 3 weeks before the closure, a directive that he was to prepare a full accounting of every homestead in the northern canyon, every resident, every structure, every claim filed or pending. No reason given, no timeline. Just the weight of federal attention turning toward a stretch of land that had, until then, gone largely unnoticed. Pharaoh did as he was told. He compiled the lists, noted the families, the single men, the parcels that bordered the high country where the timber was thick and the water ran year-round. He sent the reports and waited. And in the waiting, he began to understand that something larger than a land dispute was moving beneath the surface, something that had little to do with acreage and everything to do with control. Among the names on his list was a woman named Catherine Brennan. She'd filed a claim the previous spring, a small parcel near the canyon mouth where the creek widened into a meadow. She'd arrived alone, which was unusual but not unheard of. She'd paid her fees in coin, which suggested she had some means, and she'd set about building a cabin with the help of a few neighbors who appreciated her quiet determination. By summer, she was visibly pregnant. By early autumn, she had a son, born without complication in the cabin she'd built with her own hands, attended by the wives of 2 nearby homesteaders who'd come to trust her despite her reticence about her past. Catherine was young, perhaps 25, with dark hair she kept pinned back and a face that held no softness, only a kind of focused resolve. She didn't attend the occasional gatherings in town. She didn't seek company, but she wasn't unfriendly. When she came to the mercantile for supplies, she spoke politely, paid promptly, and left without lingering. The women who'd helped her through childbirth said she had scars on her hands, the kind that came from hard labor or something worse, but she never explained them. She called her son Thomas and kept him wrapped close against the wind. There were rumors, of course, that she was a widow fleeing debt, that she'd been cast out by her family, that she was running from a husband who'd proven dangerous. But rumors were currency in a place like Milford, and most people had learned to let them circulate without giving them weight. What mattered was that Catherine worked her land, harmed no one, and asked nothing of anyone. In the economy of frontier respect, that was enough. Yet there was something about her that drew attention, a quality she couldn't quite hide. She carried herself like someone who'd learned to watch doors and read faces, who calculated distances and exits without seeming to. When men spoke to her, she met their eyes just long enough to establish that she would not be easily intimidated, then looked away before it became a challenge. It was the behavior of someone who'd survived something and had no intention of repeating the experience. Then there was the man they called Bridger. No one knew his full name. He'd appeared in Milford the previous winter, drifting in on a day when the snow fell so thick it erased the mountains. He'd taken a room above the saloon for a week, paid in advance, and spent his time walking the outskirts of town, studying the land with the attention of someone who understood terrain the way most men understood language. He was tall, lean, with a face weathered past easy guessing of age. He wore a long coat and a hat pulled low, and he moved with the economy of someone who'd spent years in the saddle. His boots were worn but well-maintained. His rifle was a Winchester, oiled and cared for, and he carried it with the casual competence of a man who knew its weight and reach. Some thought he was a surveyor. Others, a bounty hunter. Calhoun, the blacksmith, guessed he'd been a scout, maybe for the army, maybe for one of the wagon companies that used to run the southern routes before the railroad changed everything. Pharaoh, watching him from the land office window, thought he looked like someone trying to decide whether to stay or keep moving, balanced on the edge of a choice that would define more than just his next few months. Bridger had left in early spring, heading north into the canyon. He'd returned twice over the summer, each time staying only a day or two, resupplying at the mercantile and moving on without explanation. He didn't drink in the saloon. He didn't talk beyond what was necessary. But people noticed that he always seemed to arrive when there was trouble brewing, when tensions between homesteaders flared, or when strangers passed through asking questions they had no right to ask. And when he left, things usually quieted down, though no one could say exactly what he'd done or not done to cause it. The last time anyone saw him before the closure was in mid-October. He'd come into town at dusk, his horse lathered and breathing hard, and gone straight to Pharaoh's office. The two men had spoken behind closed doors for nearly an hour. When Bridger left, Pharaoh had looked pale, shaken in a way that suggested the conversation had gone places he hadn't anticipated. Bridger had ridden north again, and that was the last Milford saw of him, until the marshals came. They arrived on a Wednesday, 4 men in dark coats with federal badges and an air of authority that didn't invite discussion. They set up at the hotel, commandeered the largest room, and spread maps across the table. The lead marshal, a man named Everett with a graying beard and cold eyes, called Pharaoh in immediately. The meeting lasted less than 30 minutes. When Pharaoh emerged, his face was ashen. By evening, word had spread. The canyon was being closed. Every homestead, every claim, every family north of the main fork had 48 hours to evacuate. No exceptions. No appeals. Federal order. The reasons given were vague. Disputed land rights, overlapping claims with railroad interests, possible survey errors that invalidated multiple filings. It sounded official, but it felt wrong, like a justification assembled after the decision had already been made. The town erupted in confusion and anger. Men gathered in the saloon, voices rising in disbelief. Women stood in doorways, children clinging to their skirts, trying to understand how lives could be upended with less than 2 days' notice. Pharaoh tried to explain that he had no power to change it, that the order came from levels of government he couldn't reach, but his explanations did nothing to soften the blow. Among those who would be displaced was Catherine Brennan. She'd built her cabin with her own hands. She'd planted a small garden, repaired the creek bank, set aside firewood for winter. And now she was being told to abandon it, to pack what she could carry and leave the rest, with an infant, with nowhere to go. She came to town the next morning, the baby wrapped against her chest, her face set in that same hard resolve. She went to the land office, waited while Pharaoh spoke to 3 other desperate homesteaders, and when her turn came, she asked only one question. She didn't argue, she didn't plead. She simply nodded, thanked him, and left. But as she walked back toward the canyon road, several people noticed the way she scanned the ridgeline, the way her hand moved to shield her son's head, as if expecting something to fall from the sky. That night, lamps burned late in nearly every home. Families packed what they could, tried to decide what a life reduced to wagon space looked like. Some wept. Others raged quietly, cursing the government, the railroads, the invisible forces that seemed to move settlers around like pieces on a board. A few began to whisper about resistance, about refusing to leave, about making the marshals enforce their order at gunpoint if that's what it took. But beneath the anger and confusion, there was something else, a sense that this closure wasn't just about land, that the speed and finality of it suggested something more urgent, something the marshals weren't saying. And in that uncertainty, fear began to spread. By the second day, most of the families had started their exodus. Wagons rolled south toward Milford, piled high with possessions, children riding atop bundles of clothing and tools. The marshals watched from their positions at both ends of the canyon, faces impassive, ensuring compliance. They were polite but unyielding. They checked names against lists. They noted who left and when, and they made it clear that after sunset, anyone still in the canyon would be considered in violation of federal law. Catherine Brennan did not come out with the others. By mid-afternoon, when the last of the wagons had passed, Pharaoh rode up to the marshal's checkpoint and spoke urgently with Everett. He gestured toward the map, pointed toward Catherine's parcel. Everett listened, then shook his head. Pharaoh's voice rose, unusual for him, and several people nearby heard him say that there was a woman alone with an infant, that she might not have received word, that someone needed to go in and make sure she got out safely. Everett's response was cold. Pharaoh stared at him, and something in his expression shifted. For a moment it seemed he might argue further, might push past the marshal and ride in himself. But he didn't. He turned his horse and rode back toward town, and those who saw him said he looked like a man who just agreed to something he'd regret for the rest of his life. The sun moved lower. The canyon fell into shadow, and Catherine Brennan remained inside. Then, just as the last light bled from the ridgeline, a lone rider appeared on the northern trail. He came from deep within the canyon, moving fast but not recklessly, his horse sure-footed on the rocky path. As he drew closer to the checkpoint, the marshals stepped forward, hands moving toward their weapons. The rider was Bridger. He didn't stop when they called out. He didn't slow. He rode straight past them, and in the fading light, those who saw him noticed something that would be talked about for years after. Wrapped in a blanket across his saddle was a bundle, small and still. And behind him, barely visible in the dusk, was a second figure. A woman riding close, her face hidden beneath a shawl, a child clutched tight against her chest. The marshals shouted. One raised his rifle. But Bridger was already past, already disappearing into the trees that lined the road south. The woman followed, and by the time the marshals gathered themselves to give chase, both riders had vanished into the gathering dark. Everett stood at the checkpoint, furious, barking orders. But there was confusion now, uncertainty about what they'd just witnessed and what it meant. And in that confusion, Bridger and the woman he'd pulled from the canyon slipped away, ghosts moving through a landscape that had already begun to forget them. By full dark, the canyon was sealed. The marshals posted guards at both ends. And whatever they'd come to do, whatever reason had driven the closure, began in earnest. But somewhere in the night, riding trails that didn't appear on any map, a man who understood the cost of silence carried a mother and child toward safety. And the question that lingered, that would haunt Milford for months to come, was simple and unsettling. What had Bridger seen in that canyon that made him willing to defy federal law, and what was about to happen in that sealed valley that no one was supposed to witness? The morning after Bridger's ride brought a silence to Milford that felt heavier than the autumn cold. People emerged from their homes to find the marshals still posted at the canyon entrance, but something had shifted in the night. The federal men who'd been so certain, so absolute in their authority, now moved with a tense vigilance that suggested things had not gone according to plan. Marshal Everett stood in conversation with two riders who'd arrived before dawn, their horses white with lather, their faces grim with the kind of exhaustion that comes not from distance but from failure. By noon, everyone in town knew what had happened. Or rather, they knew the shape of it, the outline without the details. Bridger had defied the closure. He'd gone into the sealed canyon and brought someone out. A woman and child, most said. Catherine Brennan, according to those who'd caught a glimpse of the riders disappearing into the trees. But no one could say for certain where they'd gone or how Bridger had managed to slip past federal authorities so completely. Pharaoh stood at his office window, watching the marshals organize themselves into something resembling a search party. He'd barely slept. The guilt of his inaction sat in his chest like a stone, and now, seeing the consequences unfold, he wondered what might have been different if he'd ridden in himself, if he'd refused to accept Everett's cold dismissal. But wondering changed nothing. Catherine and her son were gone, vanished with a man whose motives remained as mysterious as his past. And the federal government, which did not take kindly to being defied, was preparing to make an example of someone. The question was whether they were hunting Bridger for breaking their closure order, or for something else entirely. That question grew more pressing as the day wore on. Everett requisitioned supplies from the mercantile without offering payment, claimed 3 rooms at the hotel for his men, and began conducting interviews with anyone who'd had contact with Bridger during his time in the territory. The interviews were not friendly conversations. They were interrogations, conducted with the presumption that everyone knew more than they were saying. Faces that had been merely authoritative the day before now carried an edge of desperation. Calhoun, the blacksmith, was among the first called in. He spent an hour in the hotel room and emerged tight-lipped and angry. When pressed by neighbors, he said only that the marshals weren't interested in Catherine Brennan. They wanted Bridger. They wanted to know where he'd been before coming to Milford, who he'd spoken to, what routes he traveled, whether he'd ever mentioned names or places that might indicate his destination. Calhoun had told them nothing useful, partly because he knew nothing, and partly because he decided in the course of that hour that whatever the federal government wanted with Bridger, it wasn't justice. Over the following days, the pattern repeated. The saloon keeper, the mercantile owner, the stableman who'd tended Bridger's horse, even the circuit preacher who'd passed through in spring, all were questioned. All came away with the same impression. The marshals were afraid, not of Bridger himself, but of what he represented. Of what he might reveal if he surfaced in the wrong place, spoke to the wrong people, carried his knowledge beyond the reach of their control. By the end of the first week, the search had expanded beyond Milford. Federal riders fanned out across the territory, checking settlements, mining camps, trading posts, anywhere a man traveling with a woman and infant might seek shelter. They carried descriptions that were maddeningly vague. Bridger was tall or maybe average height, depending on who you asked. He wore a long coat or perhaps a shorter one. His horse was bay or possibly gray or black depending on the light. The woman was young, dark-haired, with a child of uncertain age. The descriptions fit 100 women in the territory. The leads came in sporadically, each one chased down with fading enthusiasm. A man matching Bridger's description had been seen in a settlement 40 miles east, but when the marshals arrived, they found only a trapper who'd lived there for 5 years. A woman and child had passed through a way station to the south, but the station keeper said she was traveling with her husband, a farmer heading to relatives in Colorado. Someone reported hearing a baby crying in the high country, but the sound had come from a homesteader's cabin where a family of 6 lived, none of them fugitives. The false leads accumulated, the frustration grew, and slowly the certainty that had driven the initial search began to erode. Part of the problem was the land itself. The territory was vast, crossed by canyons and mountains that could hide entire parties from even determined pursuit. The trails were many, often unmarked, known only to those who'd spent years learning them. Water sources were scarce and seasonal, which meant a tracker could predict certain routes, but a man like Bridger, if he truly was a scout or guide, would know the hidden springs, the seasonal creeks, the places where the land offered passage without leaving clear signs. The other problem was the people. The settlers of Milford and the surrounding valleys had no love for the federal government's sudden intervention in their lives. They'd watched families displaced, homes abandoned, livelihoods destroyed on 48 hours' notice. When the marshals came asking questions, answers were slow in coming and often unreliable, not because people were deliberately lying, but because memory is selective, and sympathy has a way of reshaping what a person recalls. The woman at the mercantile remembered Catherine Brennan as quiet and kind, always respectful, never any trouble, but she couldn't recall if Catherine had mentioned plans or contacts, couldn't say whether she'd seemed prepared to leave or surprised by the closure. The stableman remembered Bridger's horse as well-trained and well-cared for, but couldn't remember if Bridger had asked about trails or directions. The details that might have mattered were lost in the ordinary transactions of frontier life, where people minded their own concerns and didn't pry into others. By the second week, Everett had called in additional men from the territorial office. 6 more riders arrived, along with a man who introduced himself as a federal investigator named Howell. He was younger than Everett, with a neatly trimmed mustache and the bearing of someone educated beyond the rough and tumble of frontier law enforcement. He spoke precisely, asked pointed questions, and seemed less interested in where Bridger had gone than in where he'd been before arriving in Utah territory. Howell spent 3 days poring over Pharaoh's land records, cross-referencing claims and dates, building a timeline that seemed to interest him greatly, though he shared none of his conclusions. He sent telegrams east, long messages that went out in cipher, and received replies that he read alone in his room. The marshals deferred to him, which suggested he carried authority that transcended their jurisdiction. On the 4th day, Howell called a meeting in the hotel. Only Everett and 2 other senior marshals attended, but what was said behind those doors filtered out slowly, pieced together from overheard fragments and the changed behavior of the federal men afterward. The search for Bridger became more focused, but also more secretive. Fewer questions were asked in town, the patrols became less visible, and the checkpoint at the canyon, which had been maintained with rigid discipline, was quietly abandoned. Something had changed. The nature of the hunt had shifted, and Milford found itself no longer at the center of federal attention. The marshals departed one by one over the following week, until only Howell and 2 others remained. They kept to themselves, venturing out occasionally on rides that took them north and east, following routes that didn't correspond to any of the earlier search patterns. The town exhaled, life resumed its rhythms. The families displaced from the canyon began the slow process of re-establishing themselves in new locations, some moving to other territories entirely, others filing claims in different valleys where federal interest seemed less intense. The anger faded into resignation. The questions about why the canyon had been closed remained unanswered, folded into the long list of grievances that frontier settlers learned to carry without resolution. But the story of Bridger and Catherine Brennan didn't fade. It settled into the bedrock of local memory, repeated in the saloon on long winter evenings, discussed in the mercantile when travelers came through asking about the region. The details grew softer with retelling, the edges blurred, until what remained was something closer to legend than history. Some said Bridger had been a government scout who discovered something in the canyon that powerful interests wanted kept hidden. Others claimed he'd been a Confederate guerrilla who'd never surrendered after the war, living under assumed names, always one step ahead of federal pursuit. A few whispered that Catherine hadn't been fleeing the closure at all, that she'd been Bridger's contact, that the 2 of them had been working together all along toward purposes no one could quite articulate. The stories multiplied, each version shaped by the teller's understanding of how the world worked. The romantic version had Bridger and Catherine as lovers separated by circumstances, reunited in desperate flight. The cynical version had them as criminals, confidence artists who'd used the closure as cover for some elaborate theft or fraud. The paranoid version had them as pawns in a larger conspiracy involving the railroads, the mining interests, or the territorial government's push for statehood. What all the versions shared was the absence of an ending. No one could say what had become of them. No bodies were found. No arrests were made. No graves appeared in distant cemeteries with names that matched. They had simply vanished into the vastness of the frontier, becoming part of that category of people who'd chosen, or been forced, to disappear. As autumn turned to winter and winter to spring, reported sightings continued sporadically. A man fitting Bridger's description was seen in a mining camp in Nevada. A woman with an infant was spotted boarding a train in Wyoming. Someone claimed to have shared a meal with a quiet family at a way station in Colorado, and something about the woman's manner, the way she watched the doors, reminded him of the stories from Milford. But none of the sightings could be confirmed. None led anywhere concrete. Howell remained in the territory through that first winter, though he moved his base of operations to Salt Lake City. He made occasional trips back to Milford, always unannounced, always asking the same careful questions about Bridger's time in the region. Farrow grew to dread his visits, the way Howell would sit across the desk and study the land records, as if they contained secrets that weren't visible on first reading. Once, after Howell had left following a particularly long session, Farrow noticed that several pages in his oldest ledger had been marked with faint pencil notations. He never asked what they meant. By the second year, even Howell's visits became infrequent. The federal presence in Milford dwindled to nothing. The canyon remained closed, but the reasons were never made public. Officially, the land was tied up in disputed claims that would take years to resolve. Unofficially, people who ventured near the sealed area reported that new fencing had gone up, that guards now patrolled the perimeter, and that the guards worked for private interests rather than the government. Whatever had been in that canyon, whatever had made it valuable enough to displace dozens of families, was being exploited quietly, beyond public scrutiny. The years passed. The town of Milford grew slowly, adding a second church and a schoolhouse, attracting families who knew nothing of the closure or the flight that had preceded it. The railroad spur that had stalled 30 miles short was finally completed, bringing easier access to markets and more permanent settlement. Farrow retired, turning the land office over to a younger man who'd come west after studying law in Philadelphia. Calhoun took on an apprentice, then two, and his forge became known throughout the territory for the quality of its work. But among those who'd been present that autumn of 1882, the story remained alive. They were fewer now, their memories softened by time, but they remembered. The old stableman, asked about it by his grandson, would shake his head and say only that sometimes a man does what his conscience demands, regardless of law. The woman who'd helped Catherine through childbirth, now herself a grandmother, would speak of Catherine's courage and wonder aloud what had become of that infant, whether he'd grown up knowing the circumstances of his early escape. The legend grew in inverse proportion to the facts. Where once there had been names and dates and specific details, now there were impressions, feelings, the sense that something significant had occurred without clear understanding of what it had been. Bridger became a folk hero of sorts, the man who defied unjust authority to save the innocent. Catherine became either a victim rescued from cruel fate or a mysterious figure, whose true identity remained tantalizingly obscure. The baby became a symbol of hope, of life continuing despite the forces arrayed against it. In the saloon, old-timers would argue about what Bridger had seen in the canyon that made him act. Some maintained it had been nothing more than human decency, the recognition that a woman and child shouldn't be left to whatever consequences the closure would bring. Others insisted there had to be more, that Bridger's knowledge of the canyon's secrets had been part of why he'd risked everything. The debates were circular, fueled more by whiskey than evidence, but they kept the story present in the town's consciousness. Occasionally, someone new would arrive in Milford asking questions, a journalist researching land disputes, a lawyer working on a case involving federal overreach, a historian documenting the settlement of the territory. They would hear the story, become intrigued, and spend days or weeks trying to trace its threads. They would find the old land records, the faded entries in Farrow's careful hand. They would locate witnesses, now elderly, whose recollections contradicted each other on every detail except the core fact that a man named Bridger had ridden into a sealed canyon and brought out a woman and child. But none of them found Bridger. None of them found Catherine. The trail, if it had ever been warm, was decades cold. Time moved differently in the high desert. The land changed slowly, measuring its transformation in geologic time rather than human years. But the people changed more quickly. Faces aged, voices weakened, memories became unreliable. By the turn of the century, most of those who'd witnessed the closure firsthand were gone. Their children carried fragments of the story, but fragments are not the same as the whole. The legend persisted, but its connection to actual events grew more tenuous with each passing generation. The canyon itself eventually reopened, though not to homesteading. A mining company purchased the land through a complex series of transactions that were never fully explained in public documents. They extracted something from the high country for 30 years, shipped it out on the railroad under guard, and then abandoned the site. The old homestead locations grew over with sage and scrub oak. The creek that Catherine had lived beside continued its seasonal flow, indifferent to the human stories that had briefly intersected with its banks. And then, 7 decades after Bridger's ride, something unexpected happened. The discovery came not from a dedicated search, but from bureaucratic necessity. In 1952, the state of Utah began the process of digitizing its historical land records, a massive undertaking that required clerks to sort through thousands of documents stored in archives across the state. Among those documents were the original ledgers from Milford's land office, including the volumes maintained by Pharaoh during his tenure. A young clerk named Margaret Hillstrom, working late one evening in the Salt Lake City archive, found something unusual. Tucked between the pages of Pharaoh's 1882 ledger was a folded letter, brittle with age, written in a hand that didn't match the ledger entries. The letter had no envelope, no postmark, no indication of how it had come to be there. But it was dated November 3, 1882, 6 days after the canyon closure. The letter was addressed to no one, or rather, it was addressed to whoever reads this, which suggested the writer had intended it as testimony, a record meant to survive even if he didn't. The handwriting was precise despite obvious haste, the letters formed by someone literate but not accustomed to lengthy writing. Margaret read it once, then again, then brought it to her supervisor. The letter began simply, "My name is Samuel Bridger." It went on to describe, in careful detail, what Bridger had discovered during his time in the northern canyon. How he'd been hired the previous winter by a mining surveyor to scout water sources in the high country. How he'd found evidence of mineral deposits that matched descriptions he'd seen in Army reports from his time as a territorial scout. How he'd realized that the deposits were valuable enough to attract federal attention, and that the methods required to extract them would poison the watershed for miles downstream. He described seeing the first survey crews arrive in summer, working under private contract, but with government observers present. He described his growing understanding that the homesteaders in the canyon were not going to be relocated. They were simply going to be declared trespassers on land that would be reclassified as Federal Reserve. And he described his decision to document what he was seeing, to create a record that might serve as evidence if anyone ever challenged the legality of what was being done. But the bulk of the letter concerned Catherine Brennan. Bridger wrote that he'd learned, through a contact in the territorial office, that Catherine had fled east after witnessing a crime committed by men with political connections. That she'd come to Utah seeking anonymity, filing her claim under her maiden name, hoping that distance and frontier chaos would provide cover. That the men she'd fled had never stopped looking, and that when the canyon closure was announced, Bridger had realized it provided them perfect opportunity. In the confusion of evacuation, in the chaos of displaced families and abandoned homesteads, a woman and infant could disappear permanently without questions being asked. "I could not allow that to happen," Bridger wrote. "Whatever else I am, whatever mistakes I have made, I will not be complicit in the erasure of an innocent, so I rode back in. And if you are reading this, then perhaps she made it to safety. Perhaps the boy grew up free of the shadow his mother ran from. That is what I hope." The letter ended with specific instructions. There was a second cache of documents, Bridger wrote, hidden in a location he described using landmarks and distances. Those documents contained proof of the illegal methods used to clear the canyon, proof of federal complicity in what amounted to land theft on a massive scale. If someone wanted the full story, if someone had the courage to pursue it, the proof existed. But then came the final lines, and these were what made Margaret's supervisor reach for the telephone. I leave this record knowing I may not survive to give testimony. Catherine and the boy will go north, then east, following routes I've mapped for them. I go south, drawing pursuit away. The letter was signed simply, Bridger. Within days, the letter was in the hands of state historians. Within weeks, it had been authenticated as genuinely from the period, written on paper stock common to the 1880s, in ink that had aged consistently with its claimed date. The handwriting was analyzed and found to match notations in margins of maps held by the Territorial Survey Office, maps signed by S. Bridger in the course of his scout work. The letter was real, which meant the story was real. Which meant somewhere, perhaps, the documents Bridger described might still exist. And somewhere, in the vast tapestry of lives lived across 7 decades, there might be descendants of Catherine Brennan and her son Thomas. People who carried within them the answer to what had happened after that desperate ride from the sealed canyon. People who might not even know that their family's story had become legend, that their survival represented something larger than themselves. The search, which had ended in frustration and failure in 1882, was beginning again. But this time, those looking had more than rumors and fading memories. They had Bridger's own words. They had his map to follow. And they had the possibility that, after 7 decades of silence, the truth might finally be ready to surface. In Milford, which was now a proper town with paved streets and electric lights, a few very old residents heard about the discovery. They gathered in the modern saloon, these men and women who'd been children in 1882, who'd heard their parents speak of the closure and the mysterious rider who'd defied it. They raised their glasses in a toast to a man they'd never known, whose name they'd grown up hearing. The search for Bridger's hidden documents began in spring of 1953. A small team assembled under the direction of the State Historical Society, led by a professor named Dalton, who specialized in territorial land disputes. He brought with him Margaret Hillstrom, the clerk who'd found the letter, along with 2 graduate students and a surveyor familiar with the canyon country. They carried copies of Bridger's letter, modern maps of the region, and the cautious optimism of people who understood that 70 years could erase almost anything. The landmarks Bridger had described were vague enough to frustrate precision but specific enough to narrow the search. He'd mentioned a rock formation that resembled a broken tooth, a spring that ran year-round beneath a stand of aspen, and a distance measured in a day's hard ride from the canyon's northern rim. The team spent 3 weeks working through the possibilities, hiking into country that had changed less than they'd expected. The mining company had taken what it wanted and left, and the intervening decades had allowed the land to recover its silence. They found the rock formation on their 11th day. It stood on a ridge that offered clear views in 3 directions, exactly the kind of place a scout would choose for a cache. The spring was harder to locate, hidden now by decades of growth, but the surveyor's instruments confirmed underground water where Bridger had indicated. And beneath an overhang protected from weather, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow survived the years, they found a metal box. Inside were documents, survey reports with handwritten annotations, correspondence between territorial officials and mining company representatives, financial records showing payments made to individuals whose names appeared in government directories, and photographs, remarkably preserved, showing work sites in the canyon where methods were being used that had been illegal even in 1882. It was everything Bridger had promised. Evidence of systematic fraud, of federal officials working in concert with private interests to displace homesteaders and transfer valuable land under false pretenses, the kind of corruption that was common enough in the territorial period, but rarely documented so thoroughly. Bridger had been meticulous. He'd created a record that could survive legal scrutiny, that could serve as testimony even in his absence. The discovery made newspapers across the state. Historians examined the documents, lawyers assessed their legal implications, and journalists began the work of connecting names in 70-year-old correspondence to families and institutions that still existed. Some of those connections led to uncomfortable revelations. A prominent Salt Lake City family, respected for generations, traced its fortune to mining interests that had profited from the canyon closure. A former territorial governor, long deceased but still honored with a statue in the Capitol, had received payments that corresponded suspiciously with decisions that had benefited specific companies. The past reached forward, disturbing the present. Descendants found themselves answering for actions they hadn't committed, but had unknowingly inherited. Institutions were forced to examine their founding stories, to acknowledge that what they'd understood as legitimate enterprise had been built on displacement and deception. It was not a comfortable process, but truth rarely is. Yet the documents answered only half the question. They explained what Bridger had known and why he'd acted. They vindicated his decision to defy the closure. But they said nothing about what had happened to him afterward, or to Catherine Brennan and her son. For that, the searchers would need more than hidden papers. They would need the kind of luck that connects past to present across impossible distances. That luck came from an unexpected direction. Among those who read about the discovery was a woman named Helen Mercer, living quietly in Oregon, who at 83 was old enough to remember stories her grandmother had told her as a child. Her grandmother's name had been Catherine. She'd never spoken much about her early life, had always deflected questions about Helen's grandfather with vague references to loss and hardship. But she'd kept a few items from her youth, and among them was a worn leather journal that Helen had inherited after her grandmother's death 30 years earlier. The journal had seemed unremarkable at the time. It contained notes about gardening, recipes, observations about weather and seasons. The kind of practical record that frontier women often kept. But reading about the discovery of Bridger's cache, something stirred in Helen's memory. She retrieved the journal from the attic where it had been stored with other family papers, and this time she read it differently, looking not at what was written, but at what had been carefully avoided. There were no entries before 1883. The journal began in spring of that year, in a settlement in Montana Territory, with no explanation of how the writer had arrived there or where she'd come from. The handwriting was careful, controlled, the words chosen with precision that suggested someone used to guarding information. And in the margins of certain pages, written in a different hand, were notations that looked like trail markers, the kind of shorthand a scout might use. Helen contacted the Historical Society. Within a week, Dalton and Margaret were sitting in her living room, examining the journal with the kind of reverence reserved for sacred texts. They photographed each page, compared the handwriting to samples from Catherine's land claim filing in Milford, and found enough similarities to suggest this was indeed the same woman. The margin notes matched Bridger's hand from the maps they'd examined. Slowly, carefully, they reconstructed the story. Catherine had made it to Montana Territory by late winter of 1883. The journal's early entries described finding work with a family that ran a trading post, earning her keep while her son, never named in the journal, always referred to as the boy, grew stronger. She'd stayed there 2 years, building a life that was careful and small, never drawing attention, never speaking of where she'd come from. The journal made no mention of Bridger after the first few months. But in an entry from summer of 1883, Catherine wrote, Word came today that the man who showed us the northern trails has found his rest. I cannot write more than this. I will carry the debt forever. It was the only direct reference, but it was enough. Bridger had drawn the pursuit south, just as he'd written in his letter. He'd led the marshals away from Catherine's route, bought her time to disappear into the vastness of the frontier, and somewhere in that pursuit, he'd met whatever end he'd been prepared to meet. Whether he'd died in flight, been captured and imprisoned, or simply vanished into one of the territories where names and pasts were easy to shed, the journal didn't say. Catherine had received word somehow, through whatever network of frontier communication existed. And she'd mourned privately, continuing the work of building a life for her son. The journal continued through the years, Catherine's careful documentation of ordinary days, the slow accumulation of a normal life. She eventually married a man named Mercer who appears suddenly in an 1887 entry and then becomes a constant presence. The tone of the writing shifts then, becomes warmer, less guarded. They had children together. The boy, Catherine's son from before, grew up, learned a trade, became a carpenter. He married, had children of his own. One of those children was Helen's mother. Catherine lived to be 74, dying in 1926. The journal ended a year before that, the entries growing shorter, the handwriting less steady. The final entry was dated October 15, 1925. Autumn again. The boy, now himself gray and grandfathered, brought the little ones by today. I watched them play in the yard and thought about all the autumn since. How one decision, one desperate flight, led to all this life. How we are saved sometimes not by our own strength, but by the courage of strangers who ask nothing in return. I hope he knew, wherever his road ended, that what he did mattered. That 3 generations have grown from that single act of defiance. When Margaret finished reading that entry aloud in Helen's living room, no one spoke for a long moment. Outside, Oregon rain fell softly, and somewhere in the sound was the echo of another storm, 7 decades past, that had driven a desperate woman from a canyon in Utah territory toward an uncertain future. Dalton cleared his throat finally. Did she ever tell you, your grandmother? Helen shook her head. Not directly, but sometimes when I was very young, she'd look at me in a way that suggested she was seeing something beyond me, someone who wasn't there. She was talking about Bridger, Margaret said quietly. The revelation brought a kind of closure, though not the simple kind. Catherine's story had ended in the ordinary way that most lives end, surrounded by family, having built something lasting from the fragments of a shattered beginning. Thomas, her son, had lived to be 76, dying in 1951, just a year before the discovery of Bridger's letter. He'd raised 4 children, built homes throughout Montana Territory, and been known as a quiet man who worked with exceptional care, as if every joint and corner he constructed was meant to outlast memory. But Bridger's end remained uncertain. The journal's single reference suggested he died, but whether that meant literally or simply the death of his former identity was impossible to know. Dalton spent months searching territorial records, prison rolls, cemetery listings, and newspapers from the period. He found 3 men named Samuel Bridger, who died between 1882 and 1890, but none in circumstances that matched the scout from Milford. He found 2 more who disappeared from historical record around the right time, leaving no trail beyond a certain date. In the absence of proof, theories multiplied. Some historians believed Bridger had been killed by federal agents during the pursuit, his body disposed of quietly to avoid uncomfortable questions. Others suggested he'd been captured and imprisoned under a different name, a common practice when the government wanted someone to vanish administratively. A few proposed that he'd escaped entirely, that his message about finding rest had been deliberately misleading, a way to free Catherine from any obligation to search for him. The most romantic interpretation held that he'd made it to Mexico or Canada, had lived out his years in some remote location, content with the knowledge that his final mission had succeeded. That somewhere under a different name, he'd watched sunsets over different mountains and known that the debt he'd felt, whatever debt had driven him to risk everything, had been paid in full. But the truth, as with so many frontier stories, remained elusive. The land that had hidden Catherine so successfully had also swallowed Bridger, and the passage of 7 decades had scattered whatever traces might have led to certainty. What remained was the legacy. 3 generations descended from a woman and child who should have died in a sealed canyon, who survived because one man understood that some obligations transcend law and safety. Helen Mercer's family tree spread across the West, teachers and merchants and farmers and builders, none of them knowing until now that their existence traced back to an autumn flight in 1882. The Historical Society assembled an exhibition. Bridger's letter, Catherine's journal, the documents from the cache, photographs of the canyon as it had been and as it was now. They installed it in the state capitol, where school groups and tourists could walk through and piece together the story. The exhibition was titled simply, The Debt and the Ride. It opened in autumn of 1954, 72 years after the closure. At the opening ceremony, Helen Mercer spoke briefly. She was a small woman, white-haired, with her grandmother's careful way of choosing words. "I stand here," she said, "because a man I never met decided that conscience mattered more than survival, because he understood that the future is built from small acts of courage that no one may ever acknowledge. My grandmother taught me to live with integrity. I understand now that she learned that lesson in the hardest way possible, from someone who demonstrated it at the greatest cost. We cannot repay what was given, but we can honor it. We can tell the story." The exhibition drew steady visitors through that first year and beyond. People came from across the state, some drawn by the history, others by the human story at its center. Former residents of Milford, now scattered to other towns, returned to see their community's story given official recognition. Descendants of other homesteaders displaced by the closure came to understand that what had happened to their families was documented now, acknowledged, no longer dismissible as mere frontier hardship. And occasionally, someone would stand before Bridger's letter for a long time, reading and rereading his careful words, and then move on with an expression that suggested they'd found something they'd been looking for without knowing they were searching. The years continued their work. The generation that had been young when the exhibition opened grew old. Helen Mercer passed in 1979, having spent her final decades as a volunteer at the Historical Society, answering questions about her grandmother, about the journal, about what it meant to be part of a story that had almost been lost. Her children maintained the connection, donating additional family materials, ensuring that Catherine's full life, not just her desperate escape, was part of the record. In Milford, which was by then a small city with a college and an airport, the story became part of civic identity. A historical marker was placed at the location where the canyon entrance had been sealed. The marker told the story in bronze letters, ending with words that had been debated carefully by the town council. Here, in the autumn of 1882, justice and law diverged. Those who chose justice are remembered. The canyon itself, long since exhausted of whatever minerals had made it valuable, was eventually transferred to the state as parkland. Hikers walked trails that passed abandoned homestead sites, and interpretive signs told fragments of the story: the closure, the displacement, the mysterious rider who defied federal authority. Some of the old foundations were still visible, slowly being reclaimed by earth and vegetation, monuments to the impermanence of human intention. On certain autumn evenings, when the light fell at particular angles, and the wind moved through the canyon with a sound that resembled distant hoofbeats, Rangers would tell the story to groups gathered around campfires. The details varied with each telling, shaped by what the ranger knew and what the moment seemed to require, but the core remained constant. A man named Bridger, a woman named Catherine, a choice made in defiance of authority, and the generations of life that had flowed from that choice. Whether Bridger had survived to see old age or died in the pursuit mattered less, ultimately, than what he'd done in the moment that had defined him. He'd looked at a situation where law and justice contradicted each other, and he'd chosen justice. He'd understood that Catherine Brennan's life and her son's life were worth more than his safety, and he'd acted on that understanding without apparent hesitation, without demanding recognition or reward. In an age that had grown cynical about heroes, that understood how rarely people lived up to mythologies built around them, Bridger's story endured because it was small enough to be believable. He hadn't saved a town or stopped a war. He'd helped one woman and one child escape circumstances that would have destroyed them. The scale was human. The courage required was exactly the amount any person might possess if the moment demanded it. And perhaps that was the lesson that resonated across the decades. That ordinary people, faced with moments where conscience and safety diverge, are capable of choosing conscience. That the frontier, for all its violence and hardship, had also been a place where such choices were possible, where a man could ride toward danger for no reason except that it was right, where a community could remember and honor that choice long after the immediate danger had passed. The sun set over the canyon as it had for centuries, indifferent to human stories. The rock that had witnessed Bridger's final ride continued its slow erosion, measuring time in geologic patience. The springs he'd mapped continued flowing, feeding life, that had no memory of names or dates or the debts carried by humans. But memory persisted in the descendants who walked the land, who told the stories to their children, who understood that they existed because courage had once been offered freely, without guarantee of success or survival. They carried forward what Bridger and Catherine had begun, the simple, profound act of choosing life over fear, justice over law, conscience over convenience. And in that carrying forward, the debt that could never be repaid was honored in the only way that mattered. Through lives lived with integrity, through stories told with care, through the understanding that we are all, in the end, connected by the choices we make when no one is watching, when the only law that matters is written not in books but in the human heart. The exhibition remained in the Capitol, the documents preserved, the journal protected. The land itself became the monument, the trails the pilgrimage route for those who wanted to understand what had happened and why it still mattered. And on autumn evenings, when the light grew long and the air turned cold, you could still sense something moving through that canyon, not a ghost, not a literal presence, but the echo of a choice that had rippled forward through time, touching lives that would never know his name but existed because he'd ridden back into danger when every sensible soul was riding away. That was the truth they'd found. That was the legacy that endured. Not certainty about what had become of Samuel Bridger, but absolute certainty about what he'd done and what it had meant. In a world that often obscures such clarity, that buries courage under bureaucracy and forgets the individual acts that shape collective futures, his story survived. Clean and simple, a man, a choice, a ride through darkness toward an uncertain dawn, and 3 generations later, sunlight on the faces of children who existed because someone had decided they mattered more than safety. That was enough. That was everything.